The vicarage clock struck 10 as Inspector Purbright arrived in Brimpton-on-Stour, a village whose precise neatness suggested the local inhabitants took a particular pride in the appearance of moral rectitude. Outside St. Aldhelm's Church, the early morning mist clung to the stone steps, softening the edges of carefully tended flower beds. Inside, the newly restored sanctuary lamp swung gently from its wrought iron chain, though the light it shed seemed less significant than the small folded note pinned with a brass tack to the altar rail. Mrs. Larkins, chairman of the parochial committee, hovered nearby, her fingers clasped with the habitual stiffness of one unused to expressing visible emotion. "I assure you, Inspector," she said, her voice precise and brittle, "there could be no cause for alarm. It is, I believe, merely a minor misunderstanding." Purbright's eyes lingered on the note, elegantly scrawled in ink that had faded only slightly at the edges. The words, "Some lights illuminate more than they should," were as suggestive as they were ambiguous. He made a mental note of the congregation's behavior. Mr. Hayworth, the churchwarden, shifted from foot to foot, his gaze deliberately fixed on the floor, as though avoiding the scrutiny of both Purbright and the lamp itself. Mrs. Trevors, proprietor of the local tea-house, and herself a member of the committee, murmured polite greetings while casting furtive glances toward Hayworth, her lips pursed in a manner that suggested both sympathy and tacit judgment. Even the vicar, who ordinarily spoke with a tone of mild omniscience, seemed constrained, his careful attention to ritual slightly faltering. The inspector found these observations more revealing than any open display of anger or fear. It was the quiet, measured unease that indicated the true weight of the incident. Purbright seated himself in the choir stall, observing the interplay of human facades with the keen detachment of someone accustomed to social subtleties. Minor misunderstandings, he murmured to himself, often reveal far more than admitted transgressions. The church was redolent with the scent of polish and beeswax, aromas that contrasted oddly with the cold suspicion settling across the faces of those present. The vicar busied himself adjusting hymnals, as though the manipulation of sacred texts might restore equilibrium to a scene where reputations felt precariously balanced. Hayworth fidgeted with his gloves, an otherwise trivial act that, under Purbright's scrutiny, seemed to signal defensiveness. Perhaps guilt, perhaps merely the awareness of communal eyes. As the inspector examined the note again, he became aware of a faint pattern in the room's occupants, a network of alliances and rivalries, delicately arranged and meticulously concealed. Mrs. Larkins' polished assurances masked subtle disapproval, while Mrs. Trevor's polite attentions to Hayworth betrayed mild suspicion. The young verger Thomasine lingered in the corner, ostensibly tidying hymnals, but the careful glances she cast at each adult spoke volumes of her perception of adult duplicity. Purbright noted these behaviors with the same meticulous care he would apply to a fingerprint, though in this case the evidence was reputational rather than tangible. A bell tolled in the square outside, its sound echoing faintly against the stone, prompting an involuntary shift in attention. "Have there been similar notes before?" Purbright inquired, voice calm, courteous, yet subtly insistent. Mrs. Larkins hesitated, then replied, "Nothing directly comparable, Inspector. Occasionally we receive remarks in the suggestion box, but those are generally of a practical nature. The committee has always handled such matters quietly." Her hands tightened around a handkerchief, betraying an anxiety she did not voice. Purbright, noting the brief flicker of discomfort, considered the history of minor grievances in tightly knit communities. Even trivial slights could, if fanned by imagination or resentment, assume disproportionate significance. Hayworth finally spoke, his tone deliberate and controlled. "Inspector, the lamp has always been a symbol of illumination, literal and spiritual. One might say any disturbance around it reflects more upon the observers than the object itself." His words were careful, but Purbright detected a faint defensiveness beneath their surface. It occurred to him that Hayworth's lifelong role as church warden might leave him particularly sensitive to insinuation. Even in a village as orderly as Brimpton-on-Stour, the interplay between duty and personal pride could give rise to discreet hostilities. Purbright excused himself briefly to examine the surrounding area. The brass tack holding the note was slightly bent, suggesting hurried placement, but the note itself bore no fingerprints and seemed carefully folded to conceal any identifying marks. On the shelf below the altar, a small stack of parish newsletters lay undisturbed, yet the inspector noticed that one issue contained a seemingly innocuous editorial on committee efficiency, in which Hayworth's diligence was praised in terms that were technically complimentary yet faintly patronizing. Subtlety, Purbright mused, often bore sharper teeth than outright accusation. Returning to the group, he allowed his gaze to settle once more on Mrs. Larkins. "I wonder," he said, in a tone both formal and lightly amused, whether the lamp's new brilliance might inadvertently have rekindled past disagreements that were previously dormant. She inclined her head, her expression carefully neutral, yet a micro-expression, an almost imperceptible tightening at the corner of her mouth, suggested she understood the unspoken accusation. Purbright noted it quietly. Reputational wounds could fester in silence, and sometimes the simplest objects acted as mirrors to social anxieties. By mid-morning, the inspector had assembled a tentative mental diagram of the parish, alliances, subtle resentments, and the invisible hierarchies that governed polite interaction. Each glance, each inflection, seemed to contribute to a network of observation and counter-observation. Even the vicar, who had long prided himself on serene management of parish affairs, exhibited slight perturbation, and the faint rustle of hymnals suggested he was rehearsing phrases to maintain equilibrium. Purbright's final observation before leaving the church was that the lamp had not illuminated any physical transgression, but it had cast shadows across reputations and latent anxieties. As he stepped into the cool morning air, Purbright allowed himself a small smile. There was, he realized, a subtle pattern emerging. Someone in Brimpton-on-Star wished to exploit polite caution to their advantage. The note beneath the sanctuary lamp was a catalyst, drawing attention to invisible fissures and quietly testing the community's collective composure. A single question lingered in the inspector's mind, unspoken yet pressing. Who, among these impeccably mannered faces, had chosen to wield suggestion instead of candor? The answer, he suspected, would unfold not through dramatic revelation, but through careful observation of gestures, hesitations, and the précis economy of words. Inspector Purbright arrived at the parish office promptly after breakfast, noting the punctuality of a place where timetables were regarded as a reflection of moral character. The room was small and orderly, with sunlight filtering through lace curtains to illuminate the polished oak desk, upon which lay a neatly stacked pile of registers, committee minutes, and letters. Purbright's first observation concerned the registers themselves, meticulous columns recording donations, attendance, and voting on minor matters of church administration. Even the smallest discrepancies, he knew, often revealed the subtle currents of human bias. He ran a gloved finger along a particularly precise entry for Mr. Hayworth, whose contributions, though routine, were noted with unusual emphasis. It was not negligence that mattered here, but the social calculus. Recognition, even by simple recording, could generate envy as readily as gratitude. Mrs. Larkins greeted him with her habitual stiffness, a posture that seemed intended to fortify her authority as chairwoman against the gentle encroachments of doubt. "Inspector, I trust you will find everything in order," she said, her tone courteous yet carrying a faint undertone of restrained defensiveness. Her handwriting adorned the top of every committee minute, neat, almost painfully precise, but Purbright detected the occasional over-elaboration of minor decisions, an effort perhaps to assert control in an arena otherwise subject to private dissent. The inspector noted, with quiet amusement, how politeness often masqueraded as moral rectitude in small communities. Even in routine documentation, subtle assertion of superiority could be discerned by the observant eye. Purbright asked to see the circular letters sent to parishioners over the previous 6 months. He leafed through them, noting the impeccable civility of each. Phrase. "Your attention to hymn arrangement is most appreciated," wrote one. "It is hoped that minor adjustments to pew allocation may continue to serve the common good," stated another. Beneath this decorum, however, he discerned faintly the trace of criticism, delicate as the margin of a leaf. Mrs. Larkins watched him, her expression immaculate, yet her fingers drummed briefly on the desk, a subtle signal of impatience thinly concealed. Purbright made a mental note. Over-politeness often signaled that a minor scandal, however abstract, was being contained with great care. Interviews with parish secretaries revealed an atmosphere of polite secrecy. Miss Pemberton, in particular, was careful to frame complaints in conditional language. "It may perhaps be noted," she suggested, "that Mr. Linton prefers certain hymns, though I should not presume to judge." Her phrasing, while ostensibly deferential, betrayed a certain delight in implicating others subtly. Purbright noted that indirect observation was a form of influence as potent as formal complaint. Even the choice of verbs, prefer rather than insist, served to inscribe judgment, while maintaining the appearance of neutrality. The inspector filed these subtleties alongside the register entries, a network of muted accusations, a lattice of politeness concealing genuine moral scrutiny. Mr. Linton himself appeared unexpectedly at the office, ostensibly to inquire about last month's contribution statements. He was a man of slight build, with spectacles perched carefully on the end of his nose, and he exuded a quiet confidence that seemed rehearsed. He observed the register with a faint frown, muttering almost imperceptibly, curious that the larger donations are always singled out for attention. Purbright noticed that he spoke in carefully measured tones, as though phrasing could shape perception rather than merely convey. Fact. The inspector made no immediate response, content to watch the manner in which Linton's hands nervously adjusted the edge of his jacket. Body language, he knew, often betrayed more than the finest rhetorical camouflage. As Purbright catalogued entries, he noticed a pattern. Notes in the margin consistently highlighted Hayworth's contributions, while other committee members received only passing acknowledgement. The pattern suggested subtle favoritism, or perhaps the anticipation of complaint from attentive observers. Mrs. Larkins, who had remained poised, suddenly interjected with a comment about the importance of transparency in record-keeping. Her voice, smooth and composed, betrayed the slightest inflection of irritation, which the inspector recorded silently. Even minor administrative decisions, he reflected, could serve as instruments of social signaling. Praise or omission carried weight, equivalent to more overt censure. Purbright then turned his attention to the suggestion box, long considered a vessel for minor commentary but in fact a repository of veiled judgment. Letters were folded with meticulous care, anonymity preserved, yet the content often revealed personal resentments, thinly disguised as moral concern. One letter, dated only a fortnight prior, made a subtle reference to the new sanctuary lamp. It's a curious thing how light can illuminate more than mere architecture. He folded it carefully and placed it aside, noting that its phrasing echoed the note discovered at the altar. The coincidence, he reflected, suggested either a shared literary habit among parishioners or a deliberate campaign of insinuation, each possibility equally capable of fracturing reputations. As afternoon fell, Purbright conducted a slow comparison of handwriting, tone, and phrasing across the registers, letters, and circulars. He was especially attentive to the use of MI. Tie-gating qualifiers, which often disguise criticism, perhaps it may be noted, if one might suggest. These linguistic devices, minor in isolation, together formed a lattice of subtle control, a silent arbitration of communal norms. He observed that even Mrs. Larkin's careful corrections contained traces of mild judgment, elegantly concealed under the guise of administrative propriety. The inspector smiled faintly. In small towns, moral authority was never asserted with blunt force. It was exercised through suggestion, implication, and the patient calibration of disapproval. Before leaving, he inquired gently about past disputes regarding the sanctuary lamp, particularly whether its placement or illumination had previously occasioned disagreement. Mrs. Larkins hesitated, then replied that minor preferences had existed, but nothing of import. Yet her eyes flicked briefly to a corner of the room, where a framed photograph of the church committee hung, and she straightened the frame with an imperceptible tension. Purbright, noting the gesture, recorded it mentally. The correction of a photograph might seem trivial, yet it spoke to a persistent concern for propriety, a subtle insistence that appearances conform to expectations. As he departed, the inspector allowed himself a private reflection. The lamp incident was far less about a literal object than about the social topography of Brimpton-on-Stour. Alliances, resentments, and reputational anxieties had been catalogued with painstaking subtlety, and the anonymous note appeared less as a singular act than as a symptom of latent tensions. The inspector was aware, with a slight thrill of anticipation, that the interplay of politeness and suspicion would soon yield more concrete signs. One question lingered in his mind, unspoken yet urgent: which member of the parish, polished and courteous though they may appear, woo? Next, allow silent judgment to translate into observable action. The tea-house of Mrs. Trevor's, situated at the corner of Church Lane, possessed the peculiar charm of establishments in small towns. The scent of fresh scones mingled with a faint undertone of moral surveillance. Inspector Purbright entered shortly after 2, noting with mild approval that the brass bell above the door emitted a discreetly polite chime, announcing arrivals without alarming the patrons. The room was arranged with modest precision. Lace doilies adorned polished tables, and cups of porcelain, each resting on their own saucers, reflected the afternoon sunlight. Mrs. Travers herself hovered behind the counter, dispensing tea and small quantities of civility with equal care. "Inspector, your usual?" she asked, with the slightest arch of an eyebrow that suggested both familiarity and subtle inquiry. Purbright inclined his head and took a seat near the window, where he could observe both the room and the street outside. A small party of committee members had already gathered. Mr. Linton occupied the chair nearest the fireplace, perusing a parish newsletter with deliberate concentration, as though its mere presence were evidence of conscientious oversight. Mrs. Larkins, clasping a handkerchief in one hand and a cup in the other, appeared to evaluate each detail of the table setting with careful detachment, her posture hinting at an underlying tension. Hayworth lingered near the back, ostensibly inspecting a framed photograph of the church, yet Purbright noted the occasional twitch of his fingers, betraying unease. Conversation commenced in tones measured and polite, with frequent interjections of "I trust we are all agreed," or "one must consider," phrases which, while formally courteous, carried undercurrents of judgment. The inspector's attention, as always, was drawn less to content than to the precise manner in which social pressure was enacted. Discussion drifted naturally toward the sanctuary lamp, though initially couched in indirect language. "It is curious," observed Mrs. Larkins, with a faintly arch tone, "how new illumination draws attention, even when none may be warranted." Mr. Linton nodded, murmuring, "One might say the brightest objects cast the longest shadows." Such statements, superficially benign, were charged with subtle implication, and Purbright catalogued the choice of words with the care of a chemist observing volatile compounds. The inspector noted that Hayworth remained silent, his glances toward the lamp narrowly avoiding the eyes of his colleagues. Silence, in such a setting, often spoke louder than the most elaborate assertion. It indicated both awareness and apprehension of reputational jeopardy. Mrs. Travers approached with a tray of freshly poured tea, and the brief exchanges that followed were saturated with understated tension. "I do hope the refreshments are to your satisfaction," she said to Hayworth, who inclined his head with a minimal nod, scarcely daring to acknowledge her attention. Purbright observed that the minor social niceties, the careful placement of sugar cubes, the choice of cup, the gentle avoidance of direct eye contact, functioned as measures of moral calibration. Every gesture carried weight. An unobserved slip might provoke silent censure. Every correct maneuver accrued subtle credit. Small towns, Purbright reflected, relied on this elaborate system of reputation management, where civility and suspicion were intertwined as surely as bricks in a wall. The conversation, predictably, shifted to recent committee decisions, hymn selections, pew adjustments, and roof repairs. Each topic was approached with an excess of caution, as though the mention of any misstep could escalate into prolonged moral critique. Mr. L. Inton made several gentle suggestions, phrased as questions, regarding the prioritization of donations and the seating order for future services. Mrs. Larkins responded with careful acknowledgement, yet Purbright detected a faint contraction at the corner of her mouth, a subtle micro-expression of irritation or apprehension. Hayworth, for his part, maintained a composed demeanor, yet the slight fluttering of his fingers around his teacup betrayed anxiety about the scrutiny directed at his administrative choices. At one point, Purbright allowed his gaze to wander across the room, observing the physical arrangements as much as the verbal exchanges. The fireplace, the window, and even the placement of chairs functioned as conduits for social signaling. Positions of proximity denoted alliance, distance implied mild distrust. A glance between Mrs. Travers and Linton, held for barely a second, suggested private amusement at Hayworth's mild discomfort. The inspector recorded these interactions silently, aware that in the absence of overt action, micro-behaviors often provided the most illuminating evidence. Even the choice of where to pour tea, or the angle at which a napkin was folded, could betray subtle alignments or fissures of authority. Purbright's attention returned to the anonymous note discovered beneath the sanctuary lamp. Though physically unremarkable, its phrasing had become a touchstone for communal speculation. He recalled the faintly mischievous glint in Linton's eye when he first referenced it, noting the almost imperceptible inflection that suggested curiosity mingled with self-restraint. Perhaps thought the inspector. The letter's ambiguity was its principal strength. It neither accused nor absolved, but rather provoked reflection and inevitably polite discussion laced with suspicion. The room itself seemed to absorb this tension. Even the tea-house's deco, with its quaint precision, became a stage upon which reputations were tested and minor anxieties displayed. A brief lull in conversation prompted Purbright to inquire, almost casually, whether similar incidents had occurred in the past. "We have had letters of suggestion before," said Mrs. Larkins, her voice as smooth as iced syrup, though none so pointed. "Usually they concern hymn preferences or minor matters of seating. One assumes they are expressions of concern rather than malice." Linton tilted his head, adding, "It is remarkable how lightly some perceive these notes, when the underlying import might be quite different." Purbright recorded the subtle tension. Here was polite disagreement, expressed in the guise of shared civility, yet hinting at latent moral judgment. Toward the end of the afternoon, Hayworth rose to leave, his movements deliberate and careful. Purbright noted the faint stiffening of his shoulders, a gesture almost imperceptible but suggestive of residual anxiety. Mrs. Trevors, observing him, offered a faintly ironic smile, tempered with social propriety, as though to convey even those with authority are vulnerable to the minutiae of observation. The inspector, reflecting on these interactions, considered the layered hierarchy of scrutiny that governed this parish. Alliances, minor rivalries, and silent assessments all functioned as instruments of control, deployed with subtlety rather than force. As Purbright prepared to depart, he allowed his attention to linger on Linton, who sipped his tea with a careful slowness, observing the others without appearing to do so. A tiny smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, almost imperceptible, suggesting both amusement and calculation. It was a small gesture, but for the inspector it carried significance. Someone within the parish was not merely participating in polite observation, but actively shappy. The narrative through minimal, deliberate signals. Purbright stepped into the mild afternoon air, reflecting that the lamp beneath the sanctuary, though physically unaltered, had already catalyzed a series of subtle maneuvers. A single question lingered, unspoken yet insistent. Who within this polished circle of civility would next convert quiet observation into decisive influence? The answer would not arrive in loud confession or dramatic action, but through the careful calibration of reputation and the slow, deliberate unfolding of minor acts. A puzzle as intricate and precise as the church register he had examined the day before. And in that realization, Purbright found the faintest thrill. The investigation was no longer simply about a note or a lamp, but about the invisible economy of judgment, politeness, and human foible that governed Brimpton-on-Stour. Inspector Purbright arrived at the vicarage shortly before 10, finding the morning air unusually crisp and the village streets quiet, save for the faint rustle of leaves along Church Lane. The post had arrived, and the small stack of envelopes on the vicar's desk drew his immediate attention. They were arranged with meticulous care, some bearing names of committee members, others addressed anonymously, each sealed with the proper application of wax or adhesive tape. The inspector observed the handwriting carefully. Elegant scripts, small and precise, and one or two slightly shaky, as if penned in haste or under duress. The envelopes themselves seemed to possess a dual function, physical carriers of communication and instruments of social pressure. Purbright noted, with mild approval, the way even the most innocuous letters could convey judgment without explicit accusation. Mrs. Larkins, who entered quietly to serve tea, attempted to reassure him. "Inspector, you will find that the correspondence is largely routine," she said, her voice smooth, formal, yet betraying the faintest edge of impatience. She gestured toward a particular envelope, whose edges were slightly creased. "This one," she murmured, "may be of interest, though I would hesitate to suggest any malice." Purbright raised an eyebrow, taking the note in gloved hands. The words inside were carefully chosen, almost literary in their elegance. Some lights illuminate more than merely the architecture they adorn. The phrasing was ambiguous, yet laden with implication. He set the letter aside and observed Mrs. Larkins' reaction, a subtle tightening of her jaw, almost imperceptible, betraying that the comment had struck a nerve. The inspector moved on to the remainder of the letters, cataloguing their nuances. One anonymous missive contained detailed observations on pew allocations, suggesting minor favoritism on Hayworth's part, though its phrasing remained polite, even deferential. Another lauded the vicar for his diligence in committee oversight, while carefully noting that certain members might be encouraged to exhibit equal attention. Purbright observed the interplay of commendation and critique. Civility had become a vehicle for social arbitration, and moral judgment was deployed with the delicacy of an artisan. Each letter, in its own understated way, conveyed awareness, expectation, and subtle rebuke. The vicar, who had been quietly preparing the day's sermon, offered the occasional murmur of acknowledgement. "Letters of this nature," he remarked in measured tones, "have always existed. They serve, I suppose, as reminders that the community is attentive and that appearances, however modest, carry weight." He gestured briefly to the lamp above the altar, whose polished brass reflected sunlight in a manner that suggested symbolic resonance. Purbright noted the almost imperceptible pause before the vicar resumed. Med folding papers, it was a tiny act, yet suggestive of the ways moral authority and social expectation intersected. Even mundane clerical behavior observed in isolation could reveal latent anxiety or approval. Mrs. Trevors appeared shortly thereafter, carrying a fresh tray of scones, and contributed her own understated observations. "I cannot help but notice," she said, pouring tea with precise slowness, "that some members have a curious regard for subtlety. It is almost as though they measure themselves against the collective expectation of propriety rather than the immediate matter at hand." Purbright allowed himself a slight smile. Her phrasing, outwardly casual, carried the weight of insider knowledge. She had long observed committee interactions and understood the mechanics of polite scrutiny. The inspector noted that even casual remarks in such a setting could be considered evidence, provided one possessed the patience to interpret them. Mr. Linton arrived unannounced, carrying a small bundle of notes he had prepared at home. "I trust these may provide context," he said, placing them carefully on the desk. He spoke with deliberate moderation, choosing words that implied diligence rather than overt criticism. Yet Purbright detected a faint undertone. Linton's precision suggested a desire to influence perception, to shape the moral narrative without overtly asserting authority. When questioned about the note referencing illumination, Linton inclined his head slowly. "I am always mindful of the way attention may affect reputations," he said. "Even the smallest object, if noticed in the right or wrong manner, may bear consequences." The inspector, silently impressed, recorded the statement, a confession in ambiguity, revealing both caution and awareness of human frailty. Purbright examined the handwriting across the letters, noting subtle consistencies. Certain phrases, it may be noted, one might consider with due attention, recurring in both anonymous notes and signed correspondence, suggested either a shared stylistic habit or a deliberate echo designed to cultivate doubt. The repetition of phrasing lent weight to the idea that some parishioners were consciously manipulating the moral economy of the community, deploying suggestion rather than explicit accusation. Mrs. Larkins, observing him, offered no comment. Though the faint narrowing of her eyes betrayed vigilance, she was keenly aware that reputation could be influenced by both action and perception. The inspector then turned his attention to minor annotations in the margins of the committee minutes. Comments on donation schedules, seating preferences, and hymn selection were written in diminutive script, almost as if intended to escape casual notice. Yet they were laden with subtle judgment, guiding behavior through implied expectation. Purbright considered how easily these minor corrections could become instruments of moral leverage. Even the smallest hint of disapproval, carefully embedded within procedural documentation, could generate anxiety and provoke overcompensation among the recipients. The precision and restraint in these notes exemplified the delicate balance between social order and personal resentment. By late morning, Purbright had pieced together a tentative lattice of influence. Anonymous letters, committee notes, and marginal annotations were not isolated phenomena. Rather, they formed an interconnected network through which subtle censure, reputation management, and polite manipulation flowed. Each participant, in observing or contributing to these communications, was both a judge and a subject, shaping behavior through implication and expectation. The inspector noted with mild satisfaction that, in Brimpton-on-Star, civility was not merely decorum, but a finely tuned mechanism of social governance. As he prepared to leave, Purbright allowed his gaze to linger on Mrs. Larkins. She handled the letters with impeccable care, replacing them in their respective envelopes and aligning them precisely on the desk. Yet her fingers trembled just slightly. A nearly imperceptible signal, though enough for the trained eye to detect. Was it anxiety over potential exposure, or the thrill of control? Purbright, stepping into the quiet street, pondered the enduring potency of suggestion over action, of implication over overt accusation. A faint smile touched his lips. The true puzzle lay not in the letters themselves, but in the subtle, patient orchestration of community conscience. One thought lingered as he walked toward Church Lane: which of these polite, measured correspondents would next allow their carefully concealed judgments to surface in a more observable form? The answer, he suspected, would emerge slowly, like a shadow lengthening under the late afternoon sun. The vicarage drawing-room was arranged with meticulous care, as though each piece of furniture were positioned to facilitate not only conversation, but observation. Inspector Purbright arrived shortly after 3, noting the faint scent of polished wood and ink. Chairs were placed deliberately in a semicircle around a low table where minutes, hymnals, and donation ledgers had been spread with careful precision. Mrs. Larkins, seated at the head, maintained her usual posture of controlled authority, her hands resting lightly atop a stack of papers. She greeted the inspector with a measured nod, and Purbright returned the gesture, aware that entrance and acknowledgement in such contexts were small tests of social competence. The participants already gathered exhibited the habitual reserve of individuals well practiced in the art of communal civility, the meeting commenced with the reading of minutes, delivered in the precise cadences of someone attempting to convey completeness without assertion. Mr. Hayworth, seated near the vicar, interjected with cautious clarification over a minor discrepancy in the accounts, phrasing his correction in conditional terms. It may perhaps be noted that the pew repair fund was slightly understated. The remark was technically neutral, yet it drew subtle shifts in posture among the other members. Mrs. Larkins inclined her head politely, acknowledging the point while carefully framing her response to avoid the appearance of contradiction. Purbright observed the delicate choreography. Every correction, every nod, operated as a micro-regulation of authority, enforcing hierarchy without overt confrontation. The discussion gradually turned to the sanctuary lamp, a subject ostensibly peripheral yet carrying disproportionate weight in the moral imagination of the committee. "It is curious," Mrs. Larkins remarked, "how minor modifications may attract undue attention, even when the intention is purely constructive." Linton, leaning slightly forward, added with mild emphasis, "The light does tend to reveal more than architecture. It illuminates the conduct of those around it as well." Purbright noted the almost imperceptible glance shared between Linton and Mrs. Travers, an unspoken acknowledgement that the remark contained a judgment broader than immediate observation. Hayworth, meanwhile, maintained formal composure, though his subtle adjustment of his cufflinks betrayed inner vigilance. The conversation then shifted to more ostensibly practical matters: hymn arrangements, donation schedules, and the long-debated roof repairs. Each item was approached with exaggerated care, the language of each participant tinged with politeness, yet shadowed by implied critique. Mr. Linton queried the priorities at ion of repairs with precise neutrality, yet the phrasing, "perhaps it would be advisable," suggested mild censure of those previously responsible for oversight. Mrs. Larkins responded with gentle counterpoints, highlighting procedural considerations while discreetly signaling the accepted chain of authority. Even minor disagreements were framed in the language of decorum, masking subtle rivalry with polished civility. Purbright, seated slightly apart, observed the spatial arrangements as carefully as the dialogue. Seats were chosen with intent. Proximity implied tacit alignment. Distance suggested caution or mild disapproval. The positioning of papers, the angle of hands resting on ledger margins, even the careful placement of a teacup became instruments of silent commentary. Every participant performed a dual role: actor in conversation, observer of reaction, calibrating expression and gesture to convey approval, doubt, or measured critique. The inspector recognized these subtle performances as essential to understanding the invisible architecture of social authority. At one point, Mrs. Larkins interjected over a minor debate concerning hymn selection. "It is well to remember," she observed, "that our choices, however seemingly trivial, reflect both taste and diligence in the eyes of the congregation." Her tone was impeccable, polite, yet carried the faintest trace of admonition. Hayworth inclined his head, acknowledging the principle, yet Purbright detected a twitch at the corner of his mouth, a subtle signal of unease at being scrutinized. Lynn responded in kind, framing his assent as conditional, with the deliberate ambiguity that characterized his approach. The room, outwardly calm, throbbed with silent judgment. each participant acutely aware of both their own reputation and the fragile status of others. Purbright allowed his attention to shift toward periphera. Details. A creased corner of the ledger suggested repeated consultation. A minute annotation in Linton's handwriting indicated preemptive correction of potential criticism. The slight tightening of Mrs. Trevor's fingers on her notebook suggested anticipatory vigilance. These minor cues, almost invisible to the untrained observer, revealed an intricate lattice of influence and subtle rivalry. The inspector reflected on the remarkable efficacy of indirect oversight. In Brimpton-on-Stour, moral authority was exercised as much through implication and observation as through formal decree. Discussion eventually returned to the note beneath the sanctuary lamp, prompted by Linton's delicate allusion. "It is remarkable," he said lightly, "how a single remark may ripple through perceptions, unnoticed until carefully scrutinized." Mrs. Larkins inclined her head, acknowledging the observation without comment, her expression composed yet watchful. Hayworth's slight shift in posture suggested he was registering not merely the words but the undercurrent of implication. Purbright noted that the note's significance lay less in literal meaning than in the social response it elicited, illuminating both conscious and latent anxieties. As the meeting drew to a close, Purbright allowed himself a quiet assessment of group dynamics. Alliances, realigned subtly over discussion, were now observable in micro-expressions. A glance exchanged between Mrs. Trevors and Linton, a barely perceptible contraction of Mrs. Larkins's lips, Hayworth's measured adjustment of seating posture. The lamp, though unchanged in its physical state, had become a focal point for reputational tension, a catalyst for subtle maneuvering in the moral economy of the parish. Each participant left the room with minor adjustments to self-presentation, aware that appearances were continuously audited by both peer and self. Purbright remained behind for a moment, reviewing the ledger and minutes. He noted one small annotation in the margin, a faintly ironic remark regarding Hayworth's oversight of donations, written in a hand that could not be definitively identified. It was minute, almost imperceptible, yet for the inspector it suggested that the chain of influence extended further than observed in formal discussion. As he left the room, stepping onto the quiet street, he considered the enduring potency of such minor interventions. Silent scrutiny, subtle implication, and careful suggestion were as compelling in Brimpton-on-Stour as any overt act, and the question that now lingered was both simple and pressing. Who, behind the polished facades, might next translate observation into subtle manipulation? The answer, as always, would emerge slowly, as reputations and intentions revealed themselves in imperceptible gestures. The morning mist had scarcely lifted when Inspector Purbright arrived at the village archives, a modest room above the old library where records dating back over a century were kept with painstaking care. He noted, with quiet appreciation, the faint scent of aging paper and ink, a mixture that seemed appropriate for the unhurried excavation of reputations and long-buried grievances. The archivist, a thin man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, greeted him with reserved civility. "I trust your purpose is for research rather than speculation, Inspector," he asked, his tone polite, yet edged with subtle caution. Purbright inclined his head, observing that even in small communities, the act of consulting historical records was fraught with implicit judgment. "Merely to understand context," he replied, deliberately understated. He began with Mr. Hayworth, the churchwarden whose present unease had already been documented in committee notes and casual glances at the sanctuary lamp. Parish registers, old minutes, and a scattering of letters revealed an unremarkable pattern at first glance: steady contributions, meticulous attendance, diligent performance. Yet even in these records, subtle tensions appeared. A note in 1974 regarding bell-ringing privileges hinted at a minor dispute over temporal authority, and a marginal annotation by a predecessor expressed thinly veiled disapproval. Mr. Hayworth appears diligent, yet perhaps less mindful of communal perception. Purbright smiled faintly. He had long observed that minor criticism, preserved in careful handwriting, could fester for decades, shaping the moral memory of a village. He cross-referenced this with accounts of donations and pew allocation. Hayworth's efforts, technically exemplary, were repeatedly highlighted, occasionally at the expense of others' contributions. The implicit suggestion was that praise, while ostensibly positive, could be used to provoke envy or mild resentment among attentive parishioners. Purbright noted the elegance of such social calculus. the careful balance between commendation and provocation, all achieved without overt conflict. Even Mrs. Larkins, the parochial chairwoman, had once written with precise courtesy that Hayworth's attention to detail was admirable, though perhaps over-scrupulous, a statement whose politeness concealed faint moral censure. Letters from retired parishioners, reserved alongside committee minutes, revealed the persistence of subtle grievance. One from 1962 lamented the allocation of seating during special services, observing that order and precedence may sometimes overshadow fairness. Another, unsigned, praised the lamp's illumination while hinting at Hayworth's preoccupation with ceremonial exactitude. Purbright examined these carefully. He understood that such minor annoyances, though trivial on the surface, could accumulate over decades, creating a lattice of resentment and expectation. Small-town moral economies, he reflected, often operated in units of perception rather than fact. He then studied a series of anonymous notes that had circulated following the installation of the new sanctuary lamp. The phrasing, though contemporary, echoed stylistic elements found in historical correspondence. Deliberate ambiguity, mild allusion, and the careful placement of moral observation beneath the surface of civility. Purbright recognized the signature technique: suggestion rather than accusation, implication rather than confrontation. These letters, he concluded, were not spontaneous. They were the culmination of decades of careful social calibration, activated now by a new object of attention. Even the lamp itself, physically unremarkable, had become a locus of judgment, its presence illuminating both space and latent rivalry. The inspector next considered the minor social disputes recorded in committee minutes spanning 30 years. Bell-ringing schedules, hymn selection, and the management of funds had each occasioned brief moments of polite disagreement. Marginal notes, often penned by Mrs. Larkins' predecessors, contained what appeared at first to be neutral observations. It may be prudent to consider the effect on communal perception. Purbright noted that the recurring concern was not efficiency but propriety, an obsession with appearances, and the subtle negotiation of reputational standing. Such details, he reflected, were far more instructive than overt scandal, revealing the mechanisms by which social hierarchies were maintained. He allowed his gaze to linger on a photograph of the 1983 committee, framed and preserved with deliberate care. Hayworth, younger and more confident, sat at the center, his posture exemplary, yet the slight tilt of his head hinted at self-consciousness before peers. Linton's father appeared at one edge, eyes cast downward in a gesture of deference that bordered on subservience. Even in a frozen image, Purbright could detect the invisible currents of observation, minor envy, and tacit alliance. He noted the remarkable consistency of human behavior. Social hierarchies and reputational anxiety persisted across generations, observable in gesture, posture, and expression as readily as in words. By late morning, the inspector had compiled a detailed chronology of Hayworth's life within parish service, decades of diligent attention, minor disputes, polite critiques, and cautious alliances. It was clear that the present tension surrounding the sanctuary lamp was merely the latest episode in a long continuum of observation and judgment. Hayworth's character, as revealed through documents, gestures, and letters, was a mixture of conscientious diligence and sensitivity to public perception. Purbright reflected that the lamp's symbolic value lay not in its physical properties, but in the way it illuminated reputations, expectations, and social vigilance. Mrs. Larkins entered briefly, carrying a bundle of current correspondence. She placed it on the desk, with deliberate precision, her movements almost ritualistic. "I thought it might assist your study," she said, in carefully neutral tones. Purbright observed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the faint quiver in her hands. She did not speak of personal misgivings, yet her behavior suggested apprehension regarding the convergence of history and present observation. Even those accustomed to authority could feel unease when their actions intersect. Ted with both archival scrutiny and contemporary judgment, before departing, Purbright reviewed a single line in a ledger annotation, a remark concerning a donation by Hayworth that, while framed in the language of praise, contained a faintly ironic subtext. The annotation was almost imperceptible, yet for the inspector, it symbolized the delicate interplay between acknowledgement and critique. One could discern the invisible hand of social oversight shaping behavior, guiding conscience through implication rather than directive. He left the archive with a sense of quiet satisfaction, noting the persistent power of subtlety over overt expression. Walking through the village streets, Purbright reflected that Brimpton-on-Stour's tensions were neither new nor isolated. The sanctuary lamp, recent though it was, merely catalyzed the latent moral economy of the parish. Alliances, envy, and cautious observation, these had been present for decades, recorded in ink and memory alike. A question lingered in his mind, quietly insistent, who, in the present, might now translate the accumulated judgments of decades into action, subtle or otherwise. The answer would not arrive abruptly, but would reveal itself in gesture, hesitation, or choice of words, just as the past had left its traces in the margins of carefully preserved documents. The late afternoon sun fell obliquely across the polished windows of Mrs. Trevor's tea house, casting long, delicate shadows over lace doilies and the polished brass of the tea urn. Inspector Purbright entered quietly, nodding to Mrs. Trevor's with an air of polite recognition. The room was already occupied by a scattering of parish committee members who had gathered with the semblance of casual sociality, yet were plainly attuned to observation and subtle signaling. Chairs were arranged in small clusters, and every individual seemed acutely conscious of both placement and posture, as if minor adjustments could communicate approval, disapproval, or tentative alliance. The inspector settled near the window, allowing himself the vantage of both interior and exterior, as one might survey a carefully landscaped garden in which every leaf betrayed intention. Conversation began, as often in Brimpton-on-Stour, with modest pleasantries. Mrs. Larkin spoke of upcoming services, carefully emphasizing continuity and decorum. "It is fortunate," she remarked, "that our congregational attendance has remained steady, despite minor changes in ritual." Her tone was formal, polite, yet the emphasis on minor changes suggested latent disapproval, an invitation for correction or acknowledgement. Mr. Linton, sipping his tea, responded in kind. His phrasing measured. "Consistency is, of course, valuable, yet small deviations may reveal the character of those entrusted with management." The inspector noted the gentle interplay, where civility masked a calibration of moral expectation. Even a comment on ritual scheduling could convey subtle judgment. Hayworth arrived later, entering with careful composure. He greeted each participant with a nod, his voice formal and economical. "I trust the arrangements are satisfactory," he said, and the group in turn responded with polite affirmation. Yet Purbright observed micro-expressions, a faint tightening of Mrs. Larkin's jaw, a brief twitch of Linton's lips, a measured hesitation in Hayworth's hands as he adjusted his teacup. These gestures, almost imperceptible, spoke volumes about unease, awareness of scrutiny, and anticipation of subtle critique. In Brimpton-on-Stour, reputational anxiety often registered in gesture rather than declaration, and Purbright noted each occurrence with meticulous care. The discussion drifted, as was customary, toward the sanctuary lamp. Its illumination, Linton observed lightly, seems to focus attention in unanticipated ways. Mrs. Larkins inclined her head, offering acknowledgement without elaboration, while Hayworth responded with measured politeness. One must hope that attention remains constructive rather than speculative. The observer and the inspector found amusement in the careful equilibrium. No participant overstepped, yet each signaled awareness of both social expectation and minor personal vulnerability. Even the lamp, static in its physical state, had become an instrument of psychological calibration. Mrs. Trevor's, serving scones and tea with precise gestures, interjected unobtrusively. "I find it curious," she said, lowering her voice slightly, though not in secrecy, "how attention to small matters reveals much about those who observe them." Purbright noted her phrasing, outwardly conversational, yet subtly laden with insight. Her gaze shifted briefly to Hayworth, who met it with minimal acknowledgement, and then to Linton, whose polite smile masked a glimmer of calculation. Every participant engaged in layered observation, employing minimal words and gestures to communicate complex social judgments. In such settings, the inspector reflected, civility functioned as both shield and instrument of influence. Minor disputes over hymn arrangements emerged, handled with extreme delicacy. Hayworth suggested a reordering, phrased as inquiry rather than directive. Might it be considered that adjustments could enhance participation? Mrs. Larkins acquiesced politely, though her subtle head tilt suggested the slightest measure of reservation. Linton interjected, proposing a conditional amendment. Should the congregation prefer, minor modifications could be trialed with minimal disruption. Purbright recorded each subtle negotiation, noting how authority, preference, and reputational stakes were constantly negotiated with overt confrontation. Even disagreements were choreographed to maintain social equilibrium while permitting subtle assertion of judgment. At one point, Purbright allowed his gaze to drift to peripheral details: a chair slightly angled toward Linton, a creased corner of Hayworth's notebook, the deliberate placement of a sugar bowl nearer Mrs. Larkins. Each minor adjustment functioned as tacit communication. Proximity implied tentative trust, distance suggested mild suspicion. Gestures ordinarily inconsequential became instruments of silent commentary, and the inspector catalogued them with the same attentiveness he would have applied to physical evidence. In this small, meticulously ordered community, the moral economy of gestures outweighed explicit declaration. The anonymous note beneath the sanctuary lamp, though unspoken in this gathering, remained present in all minds. Purbright observed the faint, almost imperceptible references, glances, inflections, and micro-expressions betraying thought without articulation. Linton's deliberate pacing of commentary, Mrs. Larkin's meticulous management of documents, and Hayworth's careful modulation of posture all demonstrated awareness of latent accusation and the delicate equilibrium of scrutiny. The lamp, while physically unchanged, served as a mirror, reflecting the anxieties and ambitions of those who observed it. Before leaving, Purbright noted a subtle shift in Linton's behavior. While ostensibly engaged in reviewing hymn orders, his gaze lingered for a fraction longer on Hayworth, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, an expression of quiet calculation. It was a gesture slight enough to escape notice by all but a practiced observer, yet suggestive of intention. Linton was not merely participating in polite observation, but subtly testing the boundaries of influence. Purbright, stepping into the fading lig of afternoon, catalogued the detail with quiet satisfaction. As he walked along Church Lane, he reflected on the social choreography he had witnessed. Civility deployed as subtle leverage, observation shaping behavior, and reputational anxiety mediating every gesture. The sanctuary lamp, though unaltered, had catalyzed a web of scrutiny, micro-negotiation, and psychological interplay. One question lingered persistently: which of the parishioners would next convert these carefully concealed judgments into discernible influence, and how would they choose to manifest the latent power embedded in their polite scrutiny? Purbright knew that the answer would not appear suddenly but would emerge slowly, in gestures, pauses, and understated interventions, as the intricate dance of observation continued. The parish hall was bathed in the soft glow of early evening, its high windows filtering amber light over the polished wooden benches. Inspector Purbright arrived shortly before the scheduled gathering, noting that the room's careful order seemed designed to encourage civility while leaving space for observation. A few committee members had already assembled, arranging themselves with the meticulous attention to proximity and posture characteristic of Brimpton-on-Star's social hierarchy. Mrs. Larkins presided at the head of the room, her hands lightly folded atop a leather-bound notebook. Purbright observed the quiet calculation in her composure. Every gesture, every nod, was measured to maintain authority while permitting the semblance of shared consultation. The conversation began with routine topics: upcoming donations, hymn schedules, and minor roof repairs. But the subtext was immediately apparent. Mr. Linton, seated near the fireplace, allowed his phrasing to convey both assent and mild judgment. It may be advisable, I imagine, to review the donation allocation with the customary attention. The words were polite, technically neutral, yet carried the faintest inflection of critique. Hayworth responded with careful acknowledgement, his tone formal. Yet Purbright detected the slightest hesitation, a micro-expression betraying the tension between self-interest and communal expectation. In this environment, every comment served simultaneously as information and as social maneuver. Discussion drifted to the sanctuary lamp, inevitable and delicate. Its presence, observed Mrs. Larkins, invites reflection not merely on its utility, but on the conduct it illuminates. Linton's gaze lingered briefly on Hayworth, a subtle test of attention or patience, perhaps both. Hayworth adjusted his posture slightly, a barely perceptible contraction of the shoulders that suggested awareness of scrutiny. Purbright noted the elegance of the interplay, no words overtly accused, yet observation itself functioned as judgment. Civility here operated as a medium for subtle tension, and even silence carried weight. Mrs. Trevors arrived with tea, distributing it with exacting precision. "I trust these refreshments will assist deliberation," she said, her voice polite yet lightly teasing. Hayworth inclined his head. taking the cup with deliberate care, and the inspector observed the tension in the angle of his fingers, the micro-tremor in his wrist. Linton accepted his tea more smoothly, yet his eyes continued to flick toward Hayworth, calculating the effect of observation on both mood and reputation. Even mundane gestures, the placement of a sugar cube, the handling of a saucer, functioned as instruments of silent communication. A minor disagreement emerged over hymn arrangements, seemingly innocuous yet laden with reputational implications. Hayworth proposed a reordering, phrasing it as inquiry rather than directive. Might it be considered that a slight adjustment could encourage fuller participation? Mrs. Larkins acquiesced with courtesy, though the subtle tilt of her head suggested reservation. Linton contributed a conditional amendment. Should the congregation prefer, minor modifications may be trialled. Purbright noted that even these micro-disputes were arenas for influence. Authority was asserted not through overt command but through careful language, gesture, and the management of expectation. The inspector allowed his attention to wander to peripheral details, a chair slightly angled toward Linton, a marginal note on Hayworth's ledger, the deliberate placement of napkins and teaspoons. Each act, seemingly trivial, conveyed subtle signals, alignment, caution, or minor dissent. Observation itself became the medium of judgment, and every participant engaged in dual roles, as actor and as audience, calibrating every move to balance personal interest against communal propriety. Purbright reflected that in Brimpton-on-Star, the moral economy was conducted more by implication than by expression. A faintly tense silence preceded discussion of a letter discovered recently beneath the lamp. Linton referred to it obliquely. Some remarks, though unsigned, warrant careful consideration. Mrs. Larkins nodded, her eyes briefly meeting Hayworth's in measured acknowledgement. Hayworth, careful to maintain composure, merely adjusted his seating slightly, betraying awareness without overt response. The inspector observed the elegance of this equilibrium, suspicion communicated through gesture and measured gaze, rather than declaration, anxiety mediated by civility, and judgment transmitted silently between participants. Purbright noted a subtle fracture in the previously seamless display of composure. Hayworth's hands, which had remained poised, now betrayed slight tension as he fumbled with a pen. Mrs. Trevor's distributing addition, L.T., allowed a nearly imperceptible glance toward Linton, a gesture of amused curiosity or perhaps of mild complicity. Linton, for his part, appeared unperturbed outwardly, yet the faint curve at the corner of his mouth suggested private calculation. These micro-behaviors were the first visible signs that the polite equilibrium of the parish could be perturbed, even by minor provocations, and that subtle power plays were in motion beneath the veneer of civility. The meeting concluded with routine acknowledgements, yet Purbright lingered, cataloguing what he had observed. The lamp, though unchanged, remained central, not as an object of utility, but as a focus for attention, judgment, and the subtle interplay of reputational anxiety. Even minor gestures, the adjustment of a chair, a slight smile, the alignment of documents, signaled intentions, preferences, and minor challenges to authority. Purbright reflected that the parish's social structure was a carefully maintained lattice, capable of subtle shifts that could over time produce significant consequences. As he stepped into the cooling evening, the inspector allowed himself a quiet reflection. Alliances, rivalries, and reputational anxieties had begun to surface more distinctly, evidenced in gestures, micro-expressions, and the careful management of civility. The anonymous note, though still unread aloud, had catalyzed these subtle maneuvers, revealing not only latent tensions but also individual strategies of influence. One question lingered persistently in Purbright's mind: which member of T